morning, everybody. Welcome. Interesting acoustics to this, our press conference. I wonder if that just turns down a little bit. Maybe it's the excitement. And thanks for coming to our Reform UK press conference, talking about the economy. What a week it's been. All we hear from the main two parties is about raising taxes. Who can raise them more? Is it £2,000 a person? Is it £3,000 a person? Maybe actually what we should do is focus on reducing taxes, because the truth is that British households, all of us, we're literally suffocating under the levels of high taxation that have increased under this Tory government over the last 14 years. The highest taxes for 70 years. People struggling literally to breathe under that burden of taxation. That's why we think it's right at Reform UK to focus on making it easier for all of us. How do we reduce taxes and how do we get people back into work to make work pay? This is the crucial thing that will drive economic growth, that will create activity. It's the right way to dig ourselves out of this hole. You can't tax your way out of a crisis. No, you've got to grow your way out of a crisis. And that's why we're confirming what we call the Great British Tax Cut. Yes, you see, we're the party of the workers. We know how hard it is. We know how people are suffering, are being suffocated by this burden of taxation. That's why the right thing to do, totally contrary to what the Tories have done and the Labour Party seem to accept. Now, the right thing to do is to make work pay. So let's lift the starting point at which anybody pays any income tax to £20,000 a year. That's still well below the average national salary, but well above the current level, which is about £12,570 a year. That means actually net in your pocket every year about an extra £1,500, almost £30 a week. Crucially, that frees up some 7 million people from paying any income tax at all, which just proves that Reform UK is the party of the workers. It will also change that calculation for many people who are trapped on benefits. Does it pay to go to work for how many hours a week or not? Work is a great thing. It is mentally stimulating. It's good for your health. It's good for your family. It's a great example to your children and for your local community. The more people we get off benefits, that also helps the Treasury in terms of the finances. So you say, well, hang on, Richard. How does this work? How are you going to pay for all of this? Listen in carefully. This will cost about, give or take, depending on how many people are in work, about £40 billion. Now, you've all heard of the Bank of England. I'm going to talk you through what's going on, because frankly, there is a negligent scandal going on that I've been talking about for 12 months, and I think people need to understand. The way to pay for this tax cut is to rearrange the way Bank of England organises the interest, the debt payments that it makes on all of what we call the quantitative easing, all that money that it printed in the financial crisis and during COVID. Bear with me. Just imagine, and don't try this at home because it's illegal, but imagine your neighbour is struggling a bit financially. So you say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll print off a couple of 20-quid notes on my home printer. You print those two 20-quid notes off, you give them to your neighbour. You've helped him out of his hole. You've done him a right favour. Why on earth would you then every year pay interest at base rate on the money that you've just printed and given to your neighbour to help him out? You've already done him a favour. In the nicest possible way, he doesn't need another favour. That's exactly what's going on with the Bank of England. You see, the Bank of England essentially printed over £800 billion. Impossible to imagine what that number is. It's a big number. And currently, all of that money goes through the system and ends up back at the Bank of England every night. And overnight they pay interest at base rate, currently 5.25%. You might say, so what? Well, I'll tell you why. It adds up to a lot of money. And this money is taxpayers' cash that's being paid to the rich city institutions and commercial banks. How much does that add up to? About this year, based on current interest rates, about £35 billion or more. That's about £700 per adult in the United Kingdom. Last year, it was give or take £20 billion. This is real cash. This is real money. It's your money, and it's being used to enrich the city institutions. And it's a voluntary decision by the Governor of the Bank of England and his Monetary Committee. I repeat, it's a voluntary decision to rip off the taxpayer and to enrich the city institutions. And I believe it's got to stop. I've been talking about it for a year. Now, you might say, what does Richard know? Well, I'll tell you, if you don't believe me, what about listening to two former deputy governors of the Bank of England? And if you don't want to listen to them, what about listening to a left-wing think tank called the New Economics Foundation? If you don't want to listen to them, what about listening to the economics commentator for the Financial Times? Yes, Chris Giles. And if you don't want to listen to them, you could listen to other economists like Patrick Minford, Julian Jessup. And if you don't want to listen to any of them, of course, the ultimate arbiter must be the journalist Robert Peston. Robert agrees with me and credits me with the first person to actually talk about this. This is real money, and I believe that it's gross negligence to be doing what the Bank of England is doing. It didn't matter when base rates were effectively almost zero. But now at 5.25%, this is real, hard cash being used to enrich the city institutions. I think the more people who look at this and understand this, accept the principle of what I'm talking about, and it's absolutely vital. There's another element of negligence, whilst I'm at it, that the Bank of England is continuing to do. It's the only major central bank in the world that is now doing a process of quantitative tightening. So it's selling back the money that it printed back into the market. Again, a difficult concept. It's triggering huge losses for the taxpayer. Last year, in the order of £50 billion. So when the Chancellor says that the debt interest payments have soared, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why. And nobody previously has wanted to talk about it. So I'm thinking, well, why haven't the Treasury, why hasn't the Chancellor, why haven't the Bank of England told me that I'm wrong? Maybe it's because I'm right, and they're too embarrassed to admit it because it would be too humiliating. This is really serious money, and it's absolutely vital that we talk about it, because this money could be used for the great British tax cut that would get the economy growing. Talking of growing, what about also actually helping our businesses that have been completely strangled by regulation, bureaucracy, and paperwork? One of the great Brexit benefits was to get rid of daft bureaucracy. So we've got a couple of key suggestions that will help small businesses grow and will encourage risk-taking and employing people. It's absolutely vital. That's how we create activity and growth and momentum. None of the other parties are talking about this. They're just literally praying. That's not good enough. What we need is action, and that's what Reform UK is about. So for small businesses, many people would be delighted to lift the VAT threshold from £90,000, not to £100,000, no, let's do the job properly. Let's lift it to £150,000. That will make a real difference to small businesses. The other thing that would make a real difference to sole traders, to small businesses, is again reducing regulation. And this Tory government, they introduced a bunch of rules, very complex, called IR35, that frankly has made so many people's lives misery in terms of working for small businesses, consulting, working around for different clients. It's ridiculous. The whole lot should just be abolished. Again, it would just free up activity. It would encourage work and momentum and striving. This is really important. Let me repeat. We can't tax your way out of a crisis, as the main two parties think. It's ridiculous. We've got to grow our way out of a crisis. And these are key ways that we can create activity and growth. And I just think it's absolutely outrageous that this is being prevented by what I call the chums and the mates in the city, looking after each other with this quantitative easing payments by the Bank of England. It's not good enough, folks. It's got to stop. It's got to change. And once again, it's only Reform UK that comes up with the bold, interesting solutions that's going to create growth and activity. This is a key plank to our policy. 7 million people paying no income tax, an extra £1,500. That's the fastest way to help the cost of living crisis. It's the fastest way to get people back into work. It's the right way, and it's the fair way by Reform UK on behalf of ordinary workers up and down the country. That's who we are. That's why we're surging in the polls. People are hearing about us. It's remarkable, the momentum we've got. Signs all over the place are appearing on buildings, on bridges. Something's happening out there. It's very exciting. It's wonderful. So many people enthused and engaged. And that's why I'm so delighted to introduce now, having talked about the economics, to look at some other issues to my good friend, the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage.
Richard, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I will bet you that Rachel Reeves or Jeremy Hunt wouldn't even know what Richard's just been talking about. But he's worked on this very hard for a very long time, and there is, as he said himself, a growing body of opinion that says that Richard is right. It was interesting watching the debate between Starmer and Sunak, and then participating myself in the BBC seven-wayer on Friday, or was it a debate or a cat fight? I'm not quite sure. But, debate about tax and the economy is astonishing. You know, one points to the other, you're going to put up people's taxes by £2,000 in the next 4 years. And then the other points back and says, well, actually, your plans will put up taxes by £3,000 in the next few years. And they talk about spending money on this, but saving money there. You'd think, to listen to the debate, that they're managing a balanced budget. You think it's rather like a family, deciding, well, how much money have we got to go on holiday this year? Where should we go? And what was not mentioned at all in either of those debates was debt. Debt was not mentioned at all. So let's just remind ourselves, shall we, as to what's happened. When the Conservatives took power, the amount of our accumulated national debt was about £1 trillion. It's now slightly over £2.7 trillion. That means for every man, woman and child in this country, the amount of debt per head has gone from £23,000 per person to £38,000 per person. Well, you can talk in trillions, and perhaps nobody understands what it really means. But I'll tell you what is real, and that is the interest that we're now paying on that debt. And it's 90 billion sterling. We're spending as much on debt interest as we're spending on education, which is ironic, isn't it? Because it's that generation at some point that are going to have to face up to the realities of all of this. Thus far, not been debated at all in the campaign. Projections are, whichever party wins, next year's deficit will be around about £100 billion. So we need to face up to one or two realities. We are skint, and it's getting worse. And at some point in time, we may even have trouble issuing gilts, issuing government bonds, unless the market sees we've got some solutions. And that is why the only way out is growth. And I think what Richard's just set out in particular putting up the tax threshold to £20,000 would be a very, very big step in the right direction. But as I say, there's been a complete lack of debate about debt. I found it astonishing. Now, my word of the day is momentum. We have got momentum. I have absolutely no doubt about it, whether it's walking through streets in Essex yesterday or even walking through the streets of central London today. Millions of people yesterday, whether at their family breakfasts or wherever else they went on their Sundays, were having a conversation about reform. Should we? Shouldn't we? What do you think? What should we do? And it isn't just coming from Conservative voters either. I found several people who said, well, we'd said we were going to vote Labour because we feel so disgusted by the Conservatives, but actually, now that you're here, we're seriously considering it. But to have read some of yesterday's Sunday newspapers, you wouldn't believe there was momentum. There are some practices going on in the polling industry, and these firms are all part of the British Polling Council, that are, frankly, downright dishonest and giving a very misleading opinion to the great British public as to the truth of what's going on. Yes, I know polls can be wrong. They were wrong about Brexit. So polls can be wrong, but there has to be surely some consistency of methodology. One very well-known polling company in England will say, how do you intend to vote? And it'll be Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems, Greens, other. And if you then take the trouble to go to other, you'll find a list of parties. You'll find the Women's Equality Party, a lot of parties I'd never actually heard of, and somewhere in there is reform. So what happens is, if you don't prompt for reform, you will come out at 12%. They also, one of the other practices that they also do is to reweight the undecided voters back to the 2019 general election in which this party didn't stand. But if you do prompt and you put reform on an equal footing in terms of the offering to those taking part of the poll, you're consistently at 16 to 17%. So that's where we are. But we may be just a bit closer to a tipping point than many realise. If you take the YouGov poll of last week, where we were prompted, and we came out at 17%, if you take out London and you take out Scotland, you get a very interesting picture. We are ahead of the Conservatives in the North East right now. We are ahead of the Conservatives in the North West right now. We are ahead of the Conservatives in Yorkshire and the Humber right now. We're ahead of the Conservatives in the East Midlands right now. We're ahead of the Conservatives in the West Midlands right now. We're ahead of the Conservatives in terms of male voters, and we're ahead of the Conservatives in terms of Brexit voters. Yes, we're quite a long way behind in London. Yes, we're quite a long way behind in Scotland. But actually, in significant parts of the country, we are now the challenger to Labour. Now, Labour, of course, at the moment, are some way ahead. But just as UKIP proved in years gone by that it was capable of picking up millions of Labour voters, I believe reform has that same potential too, especially as we're discussing issues that affect people's lives. The impact of a population explosion, and I think unveiling this £20,000 threshold will be very, very attractive to a large number of people. So we're very, very close to a tipping point. And I've said from the start, and people are realising this now, whilst it's great fun for broadcasters and others to try and pretend that there could be a close outcome to the election, you all know it's done. It's over. Labour have won. This is a question of who is going to provide a real voice of opposition in Parliament over the course of the next 5 years. And I think we're closer to a very big breakthrough than some of those disreputable opinion polls in yesterday's Sunday newspapers tried to imply. I have written to Professor Green, the head of the British Polling Council, and I very much hope that the polling industry becomes honest. Otherwise, I'll have a fight with them. Like I had a fight with the banks last year. I can't wait. It's up to them. It really, really is. So we're optimistic. We're going in the right direction. We're picking up momentum. Our membership is up by about 15,000 people in the course of the last 6 days. We're making progress. Money is beginning to come in, and we did admit at the start of all of this that we were struggling financially. That situation is easing, and we are very happy with where we're placed. I still believe we will get more votes across the country than the Conservative Party. In fact, their ability to implode further from here, I really wouldn't be surprised if that didn't happen. And Mr. Sunak deserting the D-Day veterans has gone down very, very badly on the doorsteps indeed. I've made a few comments about that. I've no doubt there'll be some questions on it. But believe me, that has shaken people's faith in the party which in some cases they've been voting for the whole of their lives. So we're on our way. We're on our way. We're in second place in some pretty significant geographical parts of the country. And so the message, if you do live in the North or the Midlands, live in red wall seats, and some other seats in East Anglia and the South, the message is very, very clear. If you vote Conservative in those seats, you will get Labour. If you vote Conservative in those seats, you will split the vote and make it easy for the Labour Party. And that is just how much the dynamics of this election have changed over the course of the last week. Thank you. Richard, come and join me for questions, please.
Great, thank you. So, you've heard our thoughts on the economics, the Great British tax cut, the polling industry. Who'd like to start with a question? Lady Serve, just say who you're from.
Hi, Lucy Manning from BBC News. There's a story the BBC are running today about one of your candidates, Ian Gribbin in Bexhill and Batley, who wrote that the UK would have been far better if it had taken Hitler up on his offer of neutrality instead of fighting the Nazis, and that women were the sponging gender. I just wondered if you thought he was a suitable candidate, and have you got a problem with some of your candidates?
Oh, not as big a problem as the Green Party. We've had to suspend 20 of their candidates for putting out really vile anti-Semitic tweets. I think, do you know something? I think every party will suffer because it was a snap election. We had put in place, you put in place a big vetting programme, but we ran out of time.
Yeah, that's the reality. We made it clear to all candidates, and if people do inappropriate things, say daft things, then of course we'll look at it and investigate it, and that's what we do. But what we're doing is pushing on with an agenda, and the reason that we're going up in the polls is that actually people like the message, and that's what people are focused on. That's what millions of people are looking for. Hope. How do we get ourselves out of this hole? How do we grow ourselves out of this hole? So look, we'll look at all these things, but the reality is we've got action, momentum, and we're moving forwards.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask you about your plan for bank reserves. So is the plan to stop paying interest altogether on reserves, or are you hoping to introduce a tiered system like the ECB? Where would that threshold be set? And based on that threshold, how much are you hoping to save for the public purse? And then secondly, on your tax thresholds. So do you accept that raising the thresholds for higher earners as well means that disproportionately this tax policy is going to benefit those on higher incomes? And are you content with then introducing tax cuts for the rich?
Hang on a second. The 40p tax rate, right, which was established as the top rate of tax in the 1988 budget, and that 40p top rate stayed all the way through, right? And in fact, it stayed all the way through Tony Blair's years. So both Conservative administrations and Labour administrations had accepted 40p as the top rate. But the key was, at what point do you start paying it? And if you look right throughout that long period, you find around about 1.5 million people were paying 40p tax. What the Conservatives have done, with not raising the bands in line with inflation, whilst pretending they're a tax-cutting party, it's projected by the end of 27-28, 8 million people will be paying 40p tax. People in jobs that you would never consider to be high earners have been dragged into that band. And I think the truth of it is, what Richard has done is to readjust that, to set a level at which, people doing a great job as a staff nurse, let's say, and a very important job for the community, but should a staff nurse be on 40p tax? We don't think so.
No. And actually, if you're on modest levels of pay, if you're earning £20,000 a year, proportionately, this helps you net, at the end of the week, more than anybody else. That's why it's the right thing to do. It helps the lowest paid, the least well off the most. And coming back to your point about the reserves, there are two issues here. One is the principle of it, and I think more and more people are now accepting that I'm right on the principle. And yes, we can have a debate about should you pay zero interest, which is my belief, or should you pay a little bit a tier. I believe this money didn't exist, right? It was literally printed on a computer. And I use the example, that's why I use the example at home. You print a couple of 20-quid notes at home. You've done your neighbour a right favour in the nicest possible way. You've given him a hand up. But actually, you don't need to keep paying interest thereafter. And it's a direct transfer from the taxpayer. And I just think it's wrong. Other central banks are doing things differently. Some are paying a tiered system. But I think we've got to be honest. We're in a bad state here. We've got to be bullish. And it's not right. There's a reason, a couple of months ago, that all the city banks announced unexpectedly high profits. Why? Because they had to admit that they were getting much higher interest rate payments from the Bank of England. I just think that's wrong. I think we need to look after ordinary people up and down the country.
There's a further point there, Richard, about financial management and competence. One of the defences that we get from the government is, well, of course, we had to put an extra 400 billion onto the accumulated national debt to pay for COVID. No, they didn't have to lock us down repeatedly. Lockdowns 2 and lockdown 3 were, I think, probably the biggest mistake we've ever made in peacetime in our country. There were plenty of examples out there, Florida, Sweden, other countries that took a different approach. So they can't get away with that. And by the way, Labour, I think Labour would have locked us down for even longer. We might still be locked down if Labour were in government. But here's the other thing. Everyone says, well, Rishi's good at numbers. Rishi's really good at the economics of this. Really? When we borrowed those vast sums to cover furlough, etc., we could have locked in the interest rate. When base rates were down at 0.5%, he didn't lock in interest rates. That is financial mismanagement on a gargantuan scale. It's going to end up costing us, ultimately, probably tens of billions of pounds in interest. And the bizarre thing is that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves don't even seem to have noticed.
It's unbelievable. I'm going to repeat. We think the rate of interest should be zero, and we think, as of now, the Bank of England must stop this ridiculous process of quantitative tightening. I repeat, we're the only major central bank doing it. It is literally gross negligence. Who's next? Lady, just...
Thank you. Jerry Scott from The Times. Mr Farage, what do you make of Suella Braverman saying that there's not much difference between Conservative parties and your party's policies? And Rishi Sunak has said this morning that he's not really interested in reform. Do you think that's the truth?
I had my cup of tea ready for the 5:30 news on the BBC this morning, and I actually spat quite a lot of it down my dressing gown when I heard her saying that our policies weren't... Really? Really? Is this the party that's given us... I mean, have a think about this. 1 in 30 people walking along the streets in this country, 1 in 30 of our population have come into Britain in the last 2 years. Is that the sort of policy she thinks that I support? The tax burden is the highest it's been since 1948. I mean, how she can say that, I don't know. Now, I've seen various other attacks on me over the course of the last couple of days, coming from Conservative members of Parliament, even people that I sided with during the Brexit fight. I think they are slowly but surely waking up and smelling the coffee. They're realising that many of their longest term, and as they would have seen it, most loyal supporters say enough is enough. And they are accepting the line that Labour have won already. So you may as well vote for something that you actually believe in and have the hope of building some coherent policy direction for the next 5 years. So, I mean, look, I like Suella Braverman, but I'm sorry, that comment means nothing. And you can see, can't you, whether it's Robert Buckland or whoever it is, the important thing politically to remember about the Conservative Party is it is now very much a centre party, SDP-style party, and the Suellas and people like that are actually in terms of the parliamentary party, a very small minority.
Right at the back.
Olivia Utley, GB News. Miriam Cates is a right-wing Conservative MP in the Redwall constituency who says that she admires you, Mr Farage. But she has said this morning that your tax policies are utterly unaffordable and would decimate pensions and public services. Surely she's exactly the sort of Conservative MP you would like to woo over to reform. Doesn't that concern you?
No, because she doesn't understand it yet, does she? And we haven't actually unveiled it. You know, I hinted yesterday on the Beeb that we would today talk about that policy, put it down. We've done that. Richard's explained it. There's a growing level of economic opinion that says we can afford it. So I would, with respect, ask Miriam Cates to have another look and to perhaps ask Jeremy Hunt why he's allowed this to happen.
Just at the front, sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Harry Holton, ITV News. Putting aside this policy on lifting the income tax threshold, you've also said in your manifesto you want to scrap VAT on energy bills, you want to lower fuel duty, you want to cut stamp duty, cut corporation tax. Lots of people will look at your economic plan and say that this is Trussonomics on steroids.
But it's all there.
I mean, hang on a second. You know, we're doing part of what we see as our contract with the people today. Next Monday, we'll do a full launch. We won't call it a manifesto because in most people's minds, manifesto equals lie. So we won't call it that, but we'll give you a lot more next Monday.
And the draft we've had out there, it's been out there for a couple of months on the website, actually, it does set out the costs, how you pay for it and where you invest it. And everyone accepts there's vast amounts of waste in the public sector. And whenever I talk about it, I get contacted by people working in the sector, whistleblowers, who say, Richard, you can't believe how bad it is. This idea that there's no waste out there is absolutely absurd. We've got to be honest with the British people. We've got to cut waste in the back office and invest it in the front office, on the front line. That's what you do in business. That's how you become more productive. That's how you succeed and grow. And until we do that in this country with running the country, we're never going to grow back to the levels of the 1990s and the 1980s. Just behind you, Lewis.
Everyone gets a go at our press conferences.
Absolutely.
Hi, Ben Quinn from The Guardian. You've said a Labour government is inevitable, but potentially could it be halted if Rishi Sunak falls on his sword and Reform and the Conservatives agree to an electoral pact?
How can we have an electoral pact with Robert Buckland? I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, it isn't going to happen. And anyway, why would we want to do, either of us want to do, an electoral pact with a party that we gave a very, very clear run-in to back in 2019 in that December election, and that has betrayed not just us, but millions of people who put their faith in them? Ben, it's a great story, but it ain't going to happen.
It might not be Buckland, it could be Suella, it could be any number of other people who are more palatable.
Look, if Rishi does resign, you know, I would have thought that they would probably end up with a score rather like they did in the European elections in May 2019, hovering around about 8% with 0 seats. I mean, frankly, if this wasn't an election, then I think he would have resigned already. I think to have shown over D-Day that he didn't even understand what it meant to people. He's got no connection with the country whatsoever. You know, this is your classic Winchester, Oxford, Goldman Sachs. I mean, does he even meet ordinary people? I doubt it. He doesn't understand where the centre of gravity of people's hearts are in this country. So he would have been gone, but for the election. I'd be very surprised if he resigned, but who knows?
Gentleman just in the light blue shirt.
Thank you. Fraser Knight from LBC. When you speak to the Conservatives about where we are now on taxes, they'll say it's because of COVID, it's because of the increased energy prices. Do you think that some of the policies that were put in place at the time were a mistake? Do you think furlough was a mistake? Was the energy price guarantee a mistake? And secondly, if I may as well, the Lib Dems today in their manifesto have talked about getting back into the EU single market, saying the deal we have with Europe now is not a good one, we can do much better. Do you agree with that?
So I think just quickly on the decisions that were made during the pandemic, lockdowns 2 and 3 were wholly unnecessary. We should not have done them, socially or indeed economically. And Richard, I'll leave the rest to you.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And we started talking about it, I remember, in the autumn of 2020. And the abuse we got, the vitriol, for saying that actually these lockdowns were wrong. So look, the government had to make quick decisions. But furlough went on too long, at too generous a level, and that's the reality. So, we have the courage to tell it as it is. And that's why I think actually we're going up in the polls. People like what we're saying.
And they could have locked the interest rates in, as I mentioned earlier.
Yep.
The so-called man who's good with the numbers failed to do so. On the single market, well, actually, the economics of it, in terms of trade, is going pretty well. We are signing up new trade deals around the world, and we've gone remarkably. We've gone from being the 7th biggest exporter in the world to the 4th. That isn't the bit of Brexit people are furious about. The bit they're furious about is the failure to take us away from the single market rules. That's the point. It's very easy to go back into the single market, given we haven't really come away from it. And that's part, as we see it, of the Brexit betrayal, because I can tell you, an overwhelming percentage of the 5.5 million men and women in Britain that run small companies or act as sole traders were Brexiteers, because they thought, great, that avalanche of regulation is going to stop. And actually what's happened is not only have we not moved away from those rules, but our own regulatory authorities have made life in some sectors even harder than it was as members of the European Union. And of course, the other big failure are the promises and the hopes on net migration and what would happen, let alone the events in the English Channel over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. So I think going back into a market, but you can see their logic. You rejoin the single market, you then say to people, but they're making rules over which we have no say, therefore we have to rejoin. This is an attempt to get us to rejoin. It isn't going to happen. There's no way that Starmer would even dare attempt overturn the constitutional settlement, but we're going to be tied even more closely than we are now to EU rules for the next 5 years.
And let's just look at the examples, shall we? What's going on in the European Union? Who's the biggest economy in the EU? It's Germany. How are they getting on economically? Unbelievably, they're in a worse state than we are. They've got a deeper recession and more problems for similar reasons. So this idea that the EU is the nirvana is complete nonsense. Just look at Germany, realise the problems they've got, and then say, actually, thank God we're out. Thank God we've got the freedoms to make our own decisions. May not always get them right, but at least we can look at the whole world. That's why it's still a great opportunity.
Yeah, and maybe when Marine Le Pen becomes French president in a couple of years, the Lib Dems might change their mind. You never know.
Just here.
So you mentioned Marie Le Pen there. The euro has dipped to a 2-year low against the pound following the success of Eurosceptic nationalist parties in the European elections. Should people be scared of a potential reform success when the market clearly responds so badly to the success of far-right parties?
Well, I would have thought if Reform won the election, the markets would rocket, because we'd actually be talking, I mean, some of the banking shares may not, what a pity. But I would have thought that some people that actually understand how humans operate when they're given the freedom to do so would be a very, very good thing. I think on the broader point of what those elections show is, ultimately, one of the reasons for leaving the European Union was realising that it can't survive, it won't survive, it'll probably come to a very ugly end, and so I'm pleased that we've had the great escape.
Yes, just behind you there. Hi.
Hi, thank you. Chloe Chaplin from the I newspaper. You've announced this big tax cut policy today, but as far as I can tell, there's very little detail coming about how the costing will actually work. I understand you're going to be announcing more details next week. But today, why should voters take this seriously as a policy?
Didn't you listen to Richard? Do it again, Richard.
I heard very little detail as to how the actual policy would be costed.
It's actually incredibly simple, which is that you start paying income tax when you earn above £20,000 than above £12,570. So net, in your pocket, at the end of the year, you're give or take £1,500 better off. Let's call that, amongst friends, almost £30 a week. For those on the lowest pay, that is serious, serious assistance. That goes through PAYE, so actually it's very simple. That's the detail of how it works. And I've also explained in some detail the complex issue with regard to the Bank of England and how it makes interest payments. but this is doable. These are voluntary choices by the people who lead, manage and govern our country. And the choices they are making ordinary folk poorer. We think it's a disgrace. Frankly, it's negligence. Yeah. Just behind you, gentleman there.
Thank you. Alex Wickham from Bloomberg. Just on reserves, at the moment, interest on reserves is the Bank of England's monetary policy transmission mechanism. If you reduced it to zero, how would the bank set interest rates? Does it not risk the bank losing control of interest rates? And then, Mr Farage, lots of Tories seem very worried this weekend that after the election you're going to sort of mount some sort of reverse takeover of the party. Would you be able to work with Suella Braverman or Robert Jenrick after the election, Kemi Badenoch, or would you rule out any sort of deal with the Tories after the election?
So on the first bit on the reserves, this is the QE reserves. Okay? It's not the other reserves the banks have. So before QE, before 2008, you still had the same Bank of England making decisions on interest rates. And guess what? It worked then. So of course it can work in a different way. And I repeat the point. What I'm delighted about now, there are two aspects to this, and I think that you at Bloomberg have written about this. The first is the principle of it, and then the second is, well, what's the right rate that the Bank of England should pay? Should it be tiered, as was mentioned earlier, or zero? I believe that the right rate is that it should be zero. Others might have a different view. But what the great thing is that it's Reform UK that's leading this debate, leading the way of how we actually help ordinary people. We're putting it forwards. I think people will talk about it. People in the city will talk about it. The banks will be furious. And they'll say it's an outrage. Well, of course, it's the vested interests. We're not interested in the vested interests. We're interested in decent, ordinary, hard-working families up and down the country.
Yes, I mean, if you think that the last 4 years has seen the Conservatives engage in a very public civil war, I would suggest to you that after the election that they're going to lose heavily, you ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, I can't even imagine the level of recrimination that the party is going to descend into. And therefore, the answer is quite straightforward. Once we've established the electoral beachhead for reform in the House of Commons, then of course I will say to Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick, we'd love to have you in our party. We look forward to it very much indeed.
Gentleman just in the middle there.
Hi, thank you very much. Dave Black from the Daily Mirror. Mr Farage, you've spoken a lot about patriotism over the course of this campaign.
About what?
About patriotism.
Yes.
Over the course of this campaign. Do you think Lee Anderson was being patriotic 3 years ago when he boycotted the England team? And if so, do you think support for the team should be dependent on the players not making public stands against racism?
Look, I think that the take the knee moment was one that left many of us horrified. Those of us that understood that Black Lives Matter was not what it seemed, and we've subsequently learnt the truth about it. I knew about them from America. I knew that it was a very, very dangerous Marxist agenda. And so Lee got himself confused. Could he support the England team when they took the knee? And I must admit, I was there at the final against Italy. And I wasn't pleased to see the England team take the knee. And I think, as much as possible, England teams at any sporting level should avoid political gestures. But do I doubt Lee Anderson's patriotism? No, not for one moment.
Okay. I think we're done.
Yep, we are. No, one more?
One more, just there. Don't be shy.
Thanks, David, from the Daily Mail. I'm just wondering how quickly you could raise those thresholds. Would it be the first year of a parliament, or would it be, sort of phased over time, sort of 3, 4, 5 years, whatever? Are you talking about, raising those thresholds immediately? And Nigel, if the people of Clacton put their faith in you, will you repay that faith by moving to the constituency and living there?
So, picking up the threshold points, you could do it in the first budget. That's the whole point of a Finance Act, is to make those sort of decisions. And if you're going to talk about it, this is the difference, isn't it? It's a contract, not a manifesto. If you say you're going to do it, do it.
Yeah. I'm feeling increasingly optimistic, actually, about that proposition. It felt really quite good over the last couple of days. And yes, of course, I will have to move to the constituency and spend a considerable amount of time there. Doesn't mean living there full time, because if I'm leader of this party for the next 5 years, I won't be at home very much at all.
Finding one
more
from Sky.
More.
You've enjoyed it so much you can't resist.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw one more in. Are you planning to stick to any fiscal rules? And if so, what are they?
So just say again.
Are you planning to stick to any fiscal rules? and what are they?
Are we going to bow down to the
Yeah,
OBR?
we're going to, sorry, fiscal...
Will the OBR decide what
Yeah.
we can and can't do, is what you mean?
I now call them the Office of Incompetent Forecasting. That's the reality. That's why I'm delighted. We've got a fortune teller in our party, frankly, I think as good or better than some of the nonsense that comes out of the experts. So, yeah, absolutely, and we can look at all of that in due course. But what we understand, right, is actually what helps ordinary folk up and down the country. That's why we're leading the debate on this. That's why these starting points for paying income tax is so vital. And look, the greatest fiscal rule, in my view, the greatest fiscal objective, let's get the economy growing, because a rising tide lifts all boats. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Great stuff.
Great.
Thank you, Richard.
Excellent.
Marvellous. Okay. Like a funeral.